Good afternoon, UFO enthusiasts, and welcome to the first episode of Alien Week here on The Angry Astronaut. And the reason this content exists is because you alien fans went and purchased more merchandise than any of the other viewers. Pretty remarkable, really, considering that I only started covering UFO content in earnest anyway in the last couple of years. So I appreciate your support of the channel, and thanks very much to everyone else also who made very substantial contributions to this channel over the years. And it turns out that this particular merch drop was quite successful, so chances are something will be coming back. A new merch store through Sunline will be emerging sometime after Alien Week is concluded. But let's go ahead and get to the topic at hand. It surprises me sometimes that more UFO aficionados do not make connections between relatively recent sightings and things that happened in the distant past, because it is much more difficult to explain away recent UFO sightings as being mundane objects, such as various types of experimental aircraft or drones, if similar events took place in the 1950s and early 1960s, when experimental aircraft were a little harder to come by, especially experimental aircraft that resemble the ones that were spotted a lot more recently. Perhaps the most obvious example of this, at least to me, although to my knowledge nobody else has made this connection recently, is what is called the best UFO photo ever captured. This photo was taken in the United Kingdom in 1990, and this UFO was spotted in conjunction with a Harrier jump jet that allegedly circled the UFO several times, trying to get a better look at it perhaps, until the UFO abruptly rocketed up into the stratosphere, never to be seen again. The photographs and negatives were allegedly handed over to the Ministry of Defense in the UK, and it took several years before the media acquired one of these photographs and made it available to the public. Since that time, this photo has been examined by a wide variety of experts, and no explanation has ever been submitted, at least no explanation that has ever held water. So when it comes right down to it, the story should really end there, and it would have had I not noticed this photograph that was taken in 1959 on the other side of the planet in conjunction with one of the most famous mass sightings of UFOs in history.
I don't know what it is, but it don't look normal.
As any UAP aficionado can tell you, UFOs come in all shapes and sizes, and the morphology that's pretty unusual, at least for most UFOs, are diamond-shaped UFOs, or UFOs that have some sort of strange geometric configuration. But interestingly enough, the so-called best UFO photo ever taken was of a diamond-shaped UFO, captured by two men who were apparently walking on the moors in Perthshire, Scotland on the evening of August the 4th, 1990. They claimed that they spotted an unknown diamond-shaped craft and took several photographs of it. They then reported their story to a tabloid newspaper in Glasgow called the Daily Record, and they handed over their prints and original negatives to the Ministry of Defense. The original negatives and prints then disappeared and were never published by the Daily Record. This remains a mystery to this day, along with the identity of the witnesses. This remains a mystery too, so we have no idea who took these photographs or what the entire story actually was, making the whole thing a very strange and mysterious case. Were it not for the photographs, it would be something that would be easy to dismiss, but partial documentation included in the Ministry of Defense records were acquired from the National Archives by investigators investigative journalist David Clark in 2009, but they weren't actually published in a newspaper until the 13th of August, 2022. 32 years after the sighting. And this information has been republished a number of times recently, including an article that came out in The Guardian in February of this year, 2025. This is what The Guardian had to say about this particular sighting, according to the documentation that's been acquired from the Ministry of Defense, although to be honest, a lot of this information is still pretty sketchy. On a misty evening in August of 1990, two men hiking on the moors surrounding Calvine, a pretty hamlet in Perth and Kinross, claimed to have seen a giant diamond-shaped aircraft flying above them. It apparently had no clear means of propulsion and left no smoke plume. It was silent and static, as if frozen in time. Terrified, they hit the ground and scrambled for cover behind a tree. Then, a Harrier fighter jet roared into view, circling the diamond as if sizing it up for a scuffle. One of the men snapped a series of photographs just before the bizarre craft shot away vertically and disappeared. Craig Lindsay was a press officer at a local RAF base and managed to acquire the photographs and also interviewed the witnesses. Lindsay had never seen such a clear photograph of the supposed UFO, so he forwarded the picture to the Ministry of Defense, which told him to ask the Record to send the other 5 photographs and their negatives. The Ministry of Defense also instructed him to phone the hikers, which he did. One of them told Lindsay the whole story: the diamond, the jet, how it levitated eerily with no sound and accelerated with no obvious propellant. The Ministry of Defense told Lindsay to leave the case with them. He pushed the diamond to the back of his mind. That autumn, Lindsay attended a routine mission in London, and on his lunch break, he went for a wander around the Ministry of Defense's offices and saw something familiar. There, on the wall in front of me, was a great big poster-sized print of the best of those photographs. So I spoke to the guys that were there and asked them what their other photographs were like. The ministry staff placed the other photographs on the windowsill. The snaps showed the Harrier jet moving from the right side of the frame to the left, while the diamond didn't move an inch. He quizzed some of the specialists who had investigated the photos. They told him there was no evidence of a hoax, but they didn't know what the diamond was. I gradually forgot about the whole thing, said Lindsay. Nothing had appeared from the first inquiry. I assumed that everything had just been forgotten. The Record didn't run the story. The hikers never spoke publicly about the photos, and as I said before, they've never been publicly identified, and the images weren't seen by the public for 32 years. Now, this story has other fascinating details associated with it, but the one thing that nobody seems to have grabbed upon, at least as far as I know, is whether or not this strange and rather unique diamond-shaped UFO has ever been spotted anywhere else. And in the course of my research, I came across a very similar-looking object, which was confirmed by a mass sighting of over 44 witnesses in 1950. On the island of Trinidad. Trinidad is a small, deserted, rocky island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean between the Brazilian coast and the African continent, about 750 miles off the coast of Bahia. During World War II, it was used as a military base for the U.S. and Brazilian navies engaging German U-boats. It was abandoned after the end of the war, deserted and forgotten until 1957. In October of 1957, a task force from the Brazilian Navy arrived there under the command of Captain of Corvette Carlos Alberto Bacelar. The Brazilian Ministry of the Navy had decided to build an oceanographic post and a meteorological station on the island for research connected with the International Geophysical Year, or IGY. On the 16th of January, 1958, a ship belonging to the Hydrographic and Navigation Service of the Brazilian Navy, the Almirante Saldanha, which made this trip several times since 1957, had reached Trinidad Island from Rio de Janeiro with a crew of 300 under the command of Jose Saldanha da Gama. It was about to start a return trip. Now, there was a civilian group on board as well, headed by Amilcar Vieira Filho, who was was a lawyer and a bank executive, and there were others, including a retired captain of the Brazilian Air Force named Jose Teobaldo Viegas, who had been invited to collaborate in the scientific studies which were underway at the island. There was another man named Almiro Barana, who was a professional photographer who specialized in underwater photography and also a former newspaperman. At 12:15 p.m., while the ship was preparing to depart, a strange object was sighted simultaneously by 48 observers gathered on deck. The UFO came toward the island at high speed, hovered briefly over a peak, and disappeared behind it for a short time, and then appeared again to move away towards the sea. Mr. Barana was taking pictures of the ship's maneuvers at that time, so he was on deck with his Rolleiflex Model E camera. His attention was called as Filho Viegas and Lieutenant Ribera shouted to Barana, gesticulating and pointing to the object in the sky. It took Barana about 30 seconds to get going. He then proceeded to take 6 photographs of intervals of 14 seconds. As determined by later tests, 4 of these photographs captured the object in motion. Frames 4 and 5 showed only the sea and rocky coast. The first 2 photographs were taken as the object approached the island. It then disappeared behind the central mountain, which is called Desellado Peak, for a few seconds, and it reappeared a few seconds later, now moving in the opposite direction. It appeared closer and bigger, then moved at high speed towards the sea, but Barana missed the object in the next 2 frames owing to the speed of the object and confusion prevailing on deck at the time. He did obtain a final photo when the object was already far out to sea and when it apparently had momentarily stopped in mid-air. After about 10 seconds, it moved away and disappeared in the distance. According to Barana, quote, "It made no noise, although with the shouting of the people on the deck and the noise of the sea, I cannot be certain. It had a metallic look of an ash color and has a condensation of green vapor around the perimeter, particularly in the advancing edge. Its motion was undulating, like the flight of a bat." Captain Basilar, the commanding officer of the ship, ordered that the film be developed immediately in a converted washroom on board. In order to authenticate the film, he also insisted that Barana strip to his swimming trunks before going in the darkroom to prevent his taking an already exposed film in with him. Given these precautions and nearly 50 witnesses, it is not surprising that when the Brazilian Navy requested analysis of the film, it was pronounced genuine and released to the press by the president of Brazil at the time, Mr. Juscelino Kubitschek. The photos were taken on a bright, overcast day, and the settings on the camera led to slightly overexposed negatives. It was, however, a wise decision of Barana's not to attempt to modify the settings. If he had done so, he might have lost his opportunity. As determined by the photographs, the object was tilted slightly, the upper part directed towards the motion. It appears quite sharp in photos 2 and 3, corresponding to the closest approach and minimum speed, while the contours appear slightly blurred in photos 1 and 4, corresponding to the maximum distance. In view of the distance from the camera to the object and a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second, that is sufficient to freeze an object moving at speeds of several hundred miles per hour. Consequently, the Brazilian Navy estimated the speed of the object to be between 600 and 700 miles per hour, in other words, close to supersonic speed. The matter came to the attention of the U.S. Naval Attaché in Rio, apparently aware of the attitude of the U.S. military towards UFOs at that time after the departure of Ed Ruppelt, the original head of Project Blue Book that had a much more open-minded attitude about the subject. Well, this is what this attaché had to say on March 11th, 1958. Quote, "A flying saucer sighting would be unlikely at the very barren island of Trinidad." I think it's actually Trinidad, not Trinidad. As everyone knows, Martians are extremely comfort-loving creatures. By the way, 2 years after this report was filed, Ed Ruppelt, who had published his memoirs about the subject and revealed quite a lot of details about UFO investigations that the Air Force had never been able to resolve, was dead of a heart attack at the age of 37. If you'd like to get more information on this particular mystery, part 1 of my Project Blue Book video is already up in the Patreon gallery, and part 2 will be published at the end of UFO week. You can join Patreon for as little as $3 a month. Okay, enough self-promotion. Let's complete the story. On February 25, 1958, 4 days after the pictures were first publicized by the Brazilian press, United Press reported from Rio de Janeiro that the Brazilian Navy Ministry had vouched for the Trindade photographs. The report went on, quote, Navy Minister Admiral Antonio Alves Camara said that after meeting with President Juscelino Kubitschek, that the president also vouched personally for the authenticity of the pictures. This would be a curious statement indeed to make to newsmen if the Navy had any suspicion of a hoax. The pictures and negatives were analyzed by both the Navy Photo Reconnaissance Laboratory and the Cruzeiro do Sul Aerophotogrammetric Service, both agreeing that the pictures were authentic. The latter's written conclusion stated, quote, it was established that no photographic tricks are involved. The negatives are normal. On February 22, 1958, the local newspaper Diário de São Paulo printed a statement from Commandant Paulo Moreira da Silva, which had the following to say, quote, it was not a balloon nor something operated by remote control, the object that appeared in the island of Trindade. Careful studies have been made for the Navy. The team of technicians of the Aerophotogrammetric Service of Cruzeiro do Sul signed a declaration that they found the negative of the flying saucer to be normal with no evidence of any fraud. The study and the conclusion will be sent to the National Security Council. With the testimony of all the crew of the school ship Admiral Saldanha, the photographer Almiro Barana obtained 4 photographs of the flying saucer when it flew above the island of Trindade. In the photo, not showing a double exposure, a strange device can be seen evolving around Desejado Peak. Now, keep in mind one detail that I'm sure some of you have probably noticed. The newspapers modified the photo to make the object appear to resemble more closely the way that it was described by the witnesses. A flattened sphere with a ring that closely resembled the planet Saturn, although the photos clearly demonstrate that the object didn't look like Saturn at all. And it's important to keep in mind that in 1958, flying saucers were the rage. Everything that even remotely looked like a flying saucer was identified as a flying saucer by excited witnesses at this time. As we can see in the photos, the object more closely resembles a diamond than a saucer. And if we look again at a side-by-side comparison between this object and the object that was spotted in Scotland over 3 decades later, well, the similarity is striking indeed. But what do you think? I'd like to see your opinions in the comments. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe, and also please consider supporting this channel on Patreon and especially PayPal right now. I'm trying to raise funds not only to go to Space Symposium, but once that's done, I'd really like to go to the National Archives in person and pull some CIA records that apparently have some footage of UFOs that were recorded by the CIA and examined by the U.S. Air Force, who were apparently unable to identify the objects in the footage, something I'd really like to see, but for some reason the National Archives has never digitized this footage and made it available online, so I'd like to go there in person. If you'd like to support this, again, all the details are in the description. Thanks very much for watching, and get ready for some very intriguing content for the rest of this week, and until next time, stay angry about space.